All right, let's jump right into this.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a pilot in training. You're sitting there with your instructor, about to start the engine.
Classic scenario. Exciting stuff.
Exactly. But then, bam! As soon as the propeller starts spinning, the RPMs just shoot up way past where they should be. Like 2,000 RPM, this deafening roar. The instructor yells, "Throttle back."
Oh, wow.
The student does, but nothing. The engine doesn't respond at all. They quickly shut it down, heart's probably pounding, lift the cowling to see what's going on, and there it is, the throttle rod end. It's just hanging there, completely disconnected. No bolt, no nut, just dangling.
Talk about a close call. That's a heart stopper right there.
Oh, absolutely. And the student's first reaction, she asks, "What if that happened in the air?" And her instructor's response is chilling. She says, "But how could this be? The annual inspection was signed off just yesterday."
That's the thing about these safety checks, right? You think you're good to go, but sometimes things slip through the cracks. In the story, it really highlights how these unexpected failures can happen.
It definitely makes you question those safety layers we all rely on.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that they actually found three major issues during that inspection.
Oh.
Yeah. First, there was a lack of clear responsibility. Nobody was truly owning the task. Second, the checklists, they were used incorrectly, probably rushed or misinterpreted. And lastly, pure complacency.
Like they'd gotten too comfortable not paying close enough attention.
Precisely. And these issues, they're not exclusive to aviation. They can pop up anywhere where human actions are involved, especially in those high-stakes, complex situations.
That's a good point. So today we're diving into this idea of managing risk proactively, not just reacting to problems. We'll draw on some insights from the FAA's Aviation Instructor's Handbook, a guide for, well, flight instructors. But this isn't just for pilots. This is about recognizing and dealing with potential problems in any field where the consequences really matter.
Makes sense. Thinking ahead, anticipating the what-ifs.
Right. So first things first, what exactly do we mean by risk management? What's the core concept here?
The FAA defines risk as the likelihood of something happening combined with how severe the outcome could be. So it's not just, will something bad happen, but also, how bad could it be? And this applies to so many things in life, from everyday choices like crossing a busy street to bigger life decisions.
So we're constantly evaluating risk without even realizing it.
Absolutely. Formal risk management just takes that natural process and gives it a structure, a way to identify hazards, assess how risky they are, and figure out the best way to deal with them.
So a hazard is different from a risk.
Yeah, it's an important distinction. Think of a hazard as something that exists right now, a condition, an object, something with the potential to cause harm. That loose rod end, that was a hazard. Even a dent in a propeller blade, that's a hazard. The risk is what could happen because of that hazard. It's the potential future impact.
So the risk of that dented propeller is that it could break during flight and cause engine failure.
Exactly. The risk is the potential consequence. And the amount of risk depends on a few things: how exposed you are to the hazard, how severe the outcome could be, and how likely that outcome is.
Okay, that makes sense. So where does safety fit into all of this?
Safety basically means an acceptable level of risk. And it's crucial to remember that absolute safety, where there's absolutely no risk, that's pretty much impossible.
You can't eliminate every single hazard.
Exactly. So when we talk about safety, what we really mean is that the level of risk is something we understand, something we deem acceptable for that situation.
So it's about managing the risk to an acceptable level.
That's the idea.
Now, to manage risk effectively, there are some fundamental principles to keep in mind. What are those key principles?
Well, there are four main ones. The first one is accept no unnecessary risk.
So don't take chances if you don't have to.
Right. The reward should always be worth the risk. Don't jump into low visibility on your first flight in a new aircraft, for instance. Only take calculated risks that have a good payoff.
Makes sense. What's the second principle?
It's make risk decisions at the appropriate level. Meaning, the person who can actually do something about the risk, they should be the ones making the call. A single pilot, they need to be the ones deciding their level of risk, not passengers or air traffic control.
And that ties back to accountability, right? Like we saw in that inspection story.
Precisely. If a technician sees a risk they can't address, they need to escalate it. That lack of clear responsibility can be a huge problem.
So what's the third principle?
Accept risk when benefits outweigh the costs. You need to weigh all the pros and cons. Even something seemingly risky can be okay if the benefits are clear and significantly greater than the potential downsides. Like, flying an unfamiliar aircraft in good weather might be an acceptable risk if you're gaining valuable experience. But doing the same in bad weather, that's where the risk might outweigh the benefit.
Got it. So careful calculation is key here. And what's the final principle?
Integrate risk management into planning at all levels. You don't just add risk management as an afterthought. It should be part of the entire process from day one. The earlier you identify risks, the easier they are to manage.
Like planning your route well in advance to avoid bad weather areas.
Exactly. And remember that risk management can occur anytime a hazard is identified.
So we've talked about the what and the why of risk management. Now let's get into the how. What are the steps involved in actually managing risk?
The process usually involves 3 key steps. Identify the hazard, assess the risk, and mitigate the risk. It's a simple framework, but very effective.
Let's break that down. First, identifying the hazard. What are we looking for here?
We're looking for anything that could potentially cause harm. This could be an object, a condition, a situation, anything that poses a threat. Experience plays a big role here, along with using analytical tools and checklists. For pilots, there's a helpful tool called the PAVE checklist. Yeah, it stands for Pilot, Aircraft, Environment, and External Pressures. It's a way to systematically identify hazards related to each of those areas. It's like a mental pre-flight check for your entire flight plan, not just the aircraft.
So let's say you're using PAVE. You identify a hazard, like, I don't know, a dent in the aircraft's skin. What's next?
That's where assessing the risk comes in. You found the dent. Now you need to determine how risky is this. You look at the likelihood of something bad happening because of that dent and the severity of the potential consequences.
So in our dent example, how likely is it that the dent will cause a problem during the flight? And if it does, how bad could that problem be?
Exactly. You might think, well, a dent doesn't seem that serious. But what if it's near a critical structural component? What if it affects the airflow over the wing? The assessment helps you answer those questions.
Tools like a risk assessment matrix or a FAT can help here, right?
Right. A risk assessment matrix, it's basically a grid that helps you visualize the level of risk based on likelihood and severity. A FRFRU, or Flight Risk Assessment Tool, is specifically designed for pilots to assess risks associated with a flight.
Okay, so we've identified the hazard, we've assessed the risk. What's the final step?
Mitigating the risk. That's about taking action to reduce or eliminate the risk. It could involve decreasing the likelihood of the problem occurring, lessening the potential severity, or ideally both.
So for a high-risk situation, you might take more drastic measures.
Right. If the risk is deemed unacceptable, you might delay or even cancel the flight. For medium or low risks, you might just need to be aware of them and have a plan in case something happens.
So this process isn't a one-time thing.
Not at all. Risk management is an ongoing cycle. You identify, you assess, you mitigate, and then you monitor. See if anything changes. See if new hazards pop up. And you do this throughout the entire process, not just at the beginning. And it's super important to involve everyone who's part of the operation. They often have the best understanding of what works and what doesn't.
Dense. So let's dig a bit deeper into that PAVE checklist you mentioned earlier.
Right.
It's a tool for pilots to identify hazards, right?
Right. It's a way to systematically consider potential risks related to the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and any external pressures.
So let's go through those one by one, starting with pilot. What kind of things do we think about here?
This is about honestly assessing yourself, your experience, recency of experience, physical and mental state. It's easy to overlook this part. We're so focused on checking the aircraft, but what about checking ourselves?
So even if you're legally qualified to fly, you might not be in the best shape to do so.
Exactly. That's where checklists like the IMSAFE checklist come in. Illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, emotion.
All these factors can impact your performance.
Absolutely. It's about knowing your limitations and being honest about whether you're truly fit to fly. There's a difference between what's legal and what's smart.
What about the next element, aircraft?
This one's all about the machine itself. Is it suitable for the flight? Are you familiar with it? Is it equipped for the conditions you expect? Can it handle the planned runways? Does it have enough fuel? Even seemingly small things, like checking you received the right amount of fuel, fall into this category.
So a thorough assessment of the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. What about environment? That seems pretty broad.
It is. It covers everything outside the aircraft that could impact the flight. Weather is a huge part of this. Things like cloud ceilings, visibility, winds, turbulence, thunderstorms, icing. And if you're flying in mountainous areas, you need to consider the terrain and potential downdrafts.
So it's about understanding the environment you'll be operating in.
Right. You also need to consider things like airport conditions, any NOTAMs. Those are notices to airmen about potential hazards in the airspace you'll be flying in. Are you flying over remote areas, over water? Are there any temporary flight restrictions? All these things need to be factored in.
A lot to consider there. Finally, there's external pressures. What does that entail?
This one's about those pressures that can make you rush or cut corners, even if you know better. Things like someone waiting for you at the destination, a desire to impress someone, or just that feeling of, I need to get there no matter what.
Get their itis right.
Exactly. And this can be a major contributor to accidents. It can make you downplay risks and ignore warning signs. This is where personal SOPs or standard operating procedures can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Having pre-planned strategies to deal with delays and unexpected situations can really take the pressure off.
Like having an overnight bag ready just in case.
Exactly. It takes away that pressure to get back home that same day.
So using PAVE helps us identify potential hazards. But how do we actually assess the risk in a practical sense?
It all boils down to recognizing that every flight carries some level of risk. The key is to be able to differentiate between a low-risk flight and a high-risk flight before you even leave the ground. And for single pilots, this can be challenging because you're your own safety net.
It's easy to downplay your own limitations.
Absolutely. That's why studying accident reports can be so helpful. They offer data-backed insights into risk factors.
And we talked earlier about the risk assessment matrix. How does that work in practice?
It's a simple tool, really. You've got likelihood on one axis, severity on the other. It helps you visualize the overall risk level of a situation.
So a high likelihood, high severity event would be considered extremely risky.
Exactly. And that would require significant mitigation, maybe even canceling the flight altogether.
Once you've assessed the risk, what are some practical ways to actually mitigate it?
Mitigation is all about taking concrete actions to reduce either the likelihood or the severity of the risk. It's about coming up with solutions. If you're facing marginal VFR conditions, your mitigation might be as simple as waiting for the weather to improve, taking an instrument-rated pilot with you, or even deciding to drive.
So there's a range of options depending on the situation.
Right. And sometimes mitigation means thinking long-term. If you're planning a flight to an area known for bad weather in a certain season, you might choose to fly commercially instead, change your travel dates, or even decide not to go at all.
And it sounds like those frats can be really helpful here. They help with the assessment and mitigation, right?
Absolutely. A frat gives you a structured way to assess risk, removing some of that subjectivity and wishful thinking.
So it helps you be more objective about the risks involved.
Right. It forces you to consider the various factors that contribute to the overall risk level of a flight. Things like your experience, the aircraft, the environment, even external pressures.
And how do they actually work? Do they give you a score?
Many of them do. They'll often have color-coded ranges, like green for low risk, yellow for moderate risk, and red for high risk. And depending on the score, you'll know whether you can proceed as planned, need to mitigate certain risks, or need to seriously reconsider the flight.
So it's like a traffic light system for your flight plan.
That's a good analogy.
Now, we've talked about identifying, assessing, and mitigating risk. What about the 3P model? Where does that fit in?
The 3P model, perceive, process, perform, is another framework for aeronautical decision-making. It's about developing situational awareness, evaluating the impact of hazards, and then taking action. You can think of it as working in conjunction with the identify, assess, mitigate process.
Can you give an example of how a pilot would use the 3P model in a real-life scenario?
Sure. Imagine a pilot who's relatively new to instrument flying. They're planning a flight to an airport with low ceilings for a crucial business meeting. First, they perceive the situation. They see that the ceilings are low, they recognize their own limited experience, and they acknowledge the pressure to get to that meeting.
So they're gathering information and understanding the context.
Exactly. Then they process that information. They think, okay, low ceilings plus my inexperience equals a potentially high-risk situation. The likelihood of encountering instrument conditions is significant, and the severity of the outcome could be severe.
So they're assessing the risk, and then what?
Then they perform. They choose a course of action based on their assessment. Maybe they pick a different airport with better weather, make sure they have plenty of fuel, and have a solid backup plan. Or maybe they decide it's too risky and find another way to get to the meeting.
So they take action to mitigate the risk. And this is a continuous process.
Absolutely. As the situation changes, they go through the 3P model again. They perceive the new information, they process it, and they adjust their actions accordingly.
It's like a continuous loop of decision-making.
Precisely.
We talked earlier about pilots needing to be honest with themselves about their abilities and limitations. What about the concept of pilot self-assessment and maintaining situational awareness?
Those are both crucial. Setting personal minimums is a big part of self-assessment. It's about knowing when to say no, even if regulations or the aircraft itself allow you to do something. Like in the crosswind example with Mary and Daniel, Mary recognizes that her comfort level is lower than Daniel's, so she sets a stricter personal limit for crosswind landings.
So it's about being realistic and responsible.
Exactly, and that ties into situational awareness. It's about having an accurate and up-to-date understanding of everything happening around you that could impact the safety of the flight. That includes the weather, the aircraft systems, your own physical and mental state, even what your passengers are doing.
It sounds like being a good pilot is about much more than just stick and rudder skills.
It definitely is. It's about making good decisions and managing all the different aspects of the flight. And that requires staying aware of the situation, understanding the risks, and taking appropriate actions.
What are some things that can make it difficult for pilots to maintain good situational awareness?
Several things can get in the way. Fatigue is a major one. If you're tired, your alertness and performance suffer, even if you don't realize it. Stress and workload can also contribute to a loss of situational awareness. If you're overwhelmed, you might focus too much on one task and miss other important things happening around you. Even distractions like a faulty gauge or a chatty passenger can disrupt your awareness.
And we've talked about complacency.
Right. Complacency is that overconfidence that can come from experience. You start to take things for granted, you stop double checking, and you become more susceptible to making mistakes. Automation can actually worsen complacency because it lulls you into a false sense of security.
It's like you start to trust the automation more than yourself.
Exactly. That's why it's crucial to stay engaged and monitor the automation even when everything seems to be working perfectly.
Speaking of potential pitfalls, I noticed a brief mention of operational pitfalls in the material. What are those?
Operational pitfalls are those common traps that pilots can fall into, especially when they're under pressure to complete a flight on time or please passengers. It's that get-there-itis we talked about earlier. It can lead you to make decisions that you wouldn't normally make if you were thinking clearly and objectively.
So it's about recognizing those situations where you might be tempted to cut corners and take unnecessary risks.
Right. Effective training helps pilots understand these pitfalls so they can avoid them. Now, when you're flying by yourself as a single pilot, how do you manage all these factors? You don't have another pilot to help you with decisions and tasks.
That's where single pilot resource management, or SRM, comes into play, right?
Exactly. SRM is all about managing all the resources available to you, both inside and outside the aircraft, to ensure a safe and successful flight. It includes things like aeronautical decision-making, risk management, task management, automation management, awareness of controlled flight into terrain, CFIT hazards, and situational awareness. It's about thinking ahead, being prepared, and using all the tools at your disposal.
And the 5 Ps are a key part of SRM.
Absolutely. The 5 Ps plan, plane, pilot, passengers, and programming provide a practical framework for applying SRM during single pilot operations. You're basically checking on these 5 areas at key decision points during the flight. Before you fly, before takeoff, every hour or at the halfway point of your flight, before you start your descent, and prior to entering the traffic pattern or approaching your destination.
So it's a structured way to keep track of all the important factors.
Right. It helps you stay organized, make informed decisions, and catch potential problems early on.
Let's quickly run through those 5 Ps. The plan, that's your flight plan, right?
Exactly. It includes things like your route, your fuel calculations, the weather, any temporary flight restrictions, and making sure your charts and publications are up to date. And it's important to be flexible and update your plan as needed throughout the flight.
What about the plane?
That's about assessing the aircraft itself, its mechanical condition, any obvious problems, and the status of the avionics. Especially for instrument flying, you need to consider whether you have an autopilot, its reliability, and your own proficiency using it. Don't forget about backup systems in case something fails.
And the pilot.
That's you. How are you feeling? Are you tired, stressed, experiencing any physical discomfort? Are you dealing with the effects of high altitude or long flight times? All these things can impact your decision-making and performance. The 5 P check prompts you to think about these factors throughout the flight.
What about the passengers?
Passengers can be a resource, but they can also be a source of pressure. Their needs and expectations can influence your decisions, so it's important to manage that dynamic effectively. Communicate with them, involve them in the decision-making process when appropriate, and make sure they understand the risks involved. And remember, sometimes the safest decision might mean disappointing them or adjusting your plans.
Finally, the programming.
That's about managing your avionics. When and where will you program the GPS? Are you familiar with all the systems? How comfortable are you with the automation? How will you handle any last-minute changes or reprogramming? It's all about using the technology effectively without becoming overly reliant on it.
So the 5 Ps are a continuous mental checklist to help single pilots stay on top of everything. Now, managing all this information and all these tasks in a busy cockpit must be a skill in itself. What about information and task management?
You're right. Those are essential skills for pilots. Especially with the increasing complexity of modern cockpits, pilots need to be able to effectively gather, process, and use information to make good decisions.
Scenario-based training can be really helpful here.
Absolutely. Simulating real-world situations helps pilots practice those decision-making skills in a safe environment. A simple but effective technique for dealing with information overload is the stop, look, and analyze strategy. Take a moment to pause, assess the situation, and think before you act.
What about task management? How do pilots juggle all the different tasks they need to perform during a flight?
Task management, or TM, is all about managing your workload. It's about starting tasks, monitoring them, prioritizing them, allocating your resources, pausing and restarting tasks as needed, and recognizing when you have too much on your plate. If you're feeling overwhelmed, the best thing to do is to stop, think, slow down, and reprioritize. It's better to do a few things well than to try to do everything at once and risk making mistakes.
And what about managing all that automation we've been talking about? Is there anything else to add about that?
Just to reiterate, the goal is to use automation effectively without becoming overly reliant on it. Be proficient with the systems, but don't let them replace your own skills and judgment. Always be aware of what the automation is doing, verify that it's working as expected, and be prepared to take over manually if needed.
So all these pieces, risk management, situational awareness, SRM, task management, automation management, they all feed into the bigger picture of aeronautical decision-making, or ADM.
Exactly. ADM is the foundation of it all. It's a mental process that helps pilots make sound decisions in a systematic and timely manner. It's the glue that holds everything together.
And historically, these decision-making failures were often labeled as pilot error, right?
That's right. But we're moving away from that simplistic view. Most accidents aren't caused by a single mistake. It's usually a chain of events, a series of contributing factors, what we call an error chain or poor judgment chain.
Give an example of that.
Sure. Remember the story of the private pilot who had to make a forced landing on that narrow dirt runway? That's a classic example of an error chain. You had the pilot's decision to fly in marginal weather, inadequate fuel planning, fatigue, and the eventual fuel exhaustion, all leading up to that forced landing. At any point in that chain, a different decision could have broken the chain and prevented the accident.
So it's not just about the final mistake, it's about all the decisions that led up to it.
Exactly. ADM training helps pilots recognize those links in the chain and make better choices early on.
And what are the steps involved in this decision-making process?
First, you need to define the problem. That means recognizing that something is wrong. Something is different from what you expected. Use your senses, your knowledge, your experience to pinpoint the problem. Brenda's cross-country flight where she realized she was encountering a stronger headwind than forecast, that's a good example of defining the problem.
And once you've defined the problem,
Then you need to choose a course of action. What are your options? What are the risks and benefits of each option? What do you expect the outcome to be? In Brenda's case, she had to decide whether to turn back, divert, or continue to her destination, knowing that she might be low on fuel.
yeah, the final step.
Implementing the decision and evaluating the outcome. Once you've made a decision, you need to put it into action and then monitor the results. See if your decision is having the desired effect.
So it's an active and ongoing process. Are there any factors that can consistently impact our decision-making abilities? Things that can make us more or less likely to make good choices?
Definitely. Things like stress, fatigue, and time pressure can all affect our judgment. And then there are those hazardous attitudes we talked about earlier, those ingrained ways of thinking that can lead to poor decision-making.
Like that I can handle anything attitude.
Exactly. Recognizing those hazardous attitudes and actively counteracting them is crucial.
And stress management.
Stress is a part of life, and flying can be particularly stressful at times. Learning to manage stress through techniques like relaxation, exercise, time management, and setting realistic goals can make a big difference in your decision-making abilities.
So we've talked about looking inward at ourselves and our own limitations. What about looking outward at the resources available to us when we need to make decisions?
That's a key part of good decision-making. Being familiar with all your resources, both internal and external, is essential. Internal resources are things like your knowledge, your skills, your aircraft systems, checklists, the aircraft flight manual. Even your passengers can be a resource in certain situations.
Passenger.
Sure, they can help spot traffic, provide information, or even lend a hand in an emergency, as long as you've briefed them beforehand on what to do.
Makes sense. What about external resources?
Those are resources outside the aircraft. Air traffic controllers, flight service specialists, anyone who can provide you with information or assistance. Knowing when and how to use those resources is vital.
And managing all those resources, along with all the tasks you need to perform during a flight, that's where workload management comes in, right?
Exactly. Effective workload management prevents you from getting overwhelmed. It's about anticipating high workload periods, prioritizing tasks, and doing them in a logical order. It's also about recognizing when you have too much on your plate and taking steps to reduce your workload, whether that means delegating tasks, using automation appropriately, or even asking for help from air traffic control.
So it's about staying ahead of the curve, so to speak.
Precisely.
Now, how are these essential decision-making skills actually taught to pilots? How do you instill these concepts in someone who's learning to fly?
Flight training has evolved. It's no longer just about teaching stick and rudder skills. System safety flight training is now a core part of the curriculum. It usually happens in 3 stages.
3 stages.
Right. First, you teach those basic aircraft control skills. Then, you introduce the concepts of system safety through realistic scenarios. And finally, you challenge the learner with more complex scenarios that involve multiple safety issues.
Scenario-based training, or SBT, seems to be a key part of this.
Absolutely. SBT is all about creating realistic scenarios that force learners to apply those decision-making skills in a simulated environment. It's not about rote memorization, it's about critical thinking and problem solving.
So a good scenario is one that really makes the learner think.
Exactly. It should be challenging but not impossible. There shouldn't be one obvious right answer. It should engage the learner and make them use all their knowledge and skills. And it should be realistic, something they might actually encounter in real life.
So it's about preparing them for those unexpected situations.
Right. And it's not just about reacting to problems. It's about thinking ahead and making good decisions to prevent those problems from happening in the first place.
Now, how do you assess these SRM skills? Yeah. It's not just about technical proficiency, right?
Absolutely not. You need to go beyond just checking if they performed the maneuver correctly. Did they make good decisions? Did they use their resources effectively? Did they demonstrate good situational awareness and manage their workload effectively? All those things are crucial.
So it's about evaluating the thought process behind their actions.
Precisely. And this assessment should be ongoing, not just during a check ride. Even in everyday training situations, look for opportunities to evaluate and coach their decision-making skills. Like, if they encounter a discrepancy during the pre-flight inspection, how do they handle it? Do they consult the appropriate resources? Do they make a sound judgment call?
So it's about creating those teachable moments.
Exactly. And those moments can happen anywhere. Maybe the tower offers them a landing with a tailwind. Do they accept it without question? Or do they assess the risk and potentially request a different runway? Go-no-go weather decisions are another great opportunity to assess their decision-making process.
And using SBT, you can create those realistic scenarios with simulated emergencies.
Precisely. Put them in situations where they have to think on their feet, manage their workload, and make critical decisions under pressure. And when you're grading them, remember that it's not just about technical accuracy, it's about how they arrived at their decisions.
So it's a more holistic assessment, taking into account all those SRM elements.
Right. And don't forget the importance of post-flight debriefing. Have the learner self-assess their performance and then give them your feedback. This collaborative approach helps them understand their strengths and weaknesses and learn from their mistakes. And remember, this assessment is a progressive process. You gradually increase the complexity and challenge as they gain experience and proficiency.
So wrapping this all up, it seems like proactive risk management and sound decision-making, they're not just aviation concepts.
Exactly. They're essential skills for anyone operating in complex and potentially hazardous environments.
And going back to that story we started with about that loose throttle rod, it really highlights those 3 key areas we talked about: lack of responsibility, checklist misuse, and complacency.
Absolutely. Those are the very things that good risk management and ADM practices are designed to address.
So to our listeners out there, think about your own work or your own life. Where could a more structured and proactive approach to managing risks lead to better outcomes?
Food for thought.
Indeed. And if you're interested in exploring this topic further, resources like AC 6022, the FAA's advisory circular on aeronautical decision-making, are a great place to start.
Definitely worth checking out. Until next time, fly safe.
And make good decisions.